So, hi, Barry.
Hey, Gene.
I'm so glad to have you here. So, everybody, this is Barry Regan. He and I did a TEDx talk through San Antonio a couple of months ago. And after hearing him speak, I said, "Oh, I want this man to be on the podcast." What he has to say was interesting to me and enlightening to me. So, first, a bit about Barry. He has just been appointed to the university faculty of the College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Purdue University Global. So, congratulations, Barry. It's
Thank you. Thank you very much.
exciting to start a new job. Barry has taught courses in public speaking, interpersonal communications, and intercultural communication. The intercultural communication is a very exciting field and part of why I wanted him here. He has been delivered at least two TEDx talks, including the one with me. He holds a BA in Communication Studies from Nevada, MA in Communications from Arkansas. Oh, my family's from Arkansas. And,
That's awesome.
and an EDD in Higher Education Leadership from Grand Canyon University. So he's an educated man. In his spare time, he loves going birding and hiking with his 1-year-old daughter Fallon. Fallon, is that how you pronounce it?
Yep. Fallon.
Fallon, and watching football. So
Yep.
welcome, Barry.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gene, for having me. This is really, really cool and an honor to be on this.
Well, I'm delighted to have you. So let's start with what you said on the TEDx talk that we did together that led me to want you to even be here. You said that we were talking about ethnic identifications. I identify as Black, sometimes Black African American. And you said there was a problem with whites as an identity. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah. One of the interesting things when I started doing a kind of deeper dive in intercultural communication, some of the different textbooks, I came across research that said that individuals who identify as European American or their specific European American heritage were, on balance, more likely to demonstrate less bias in cultural ethnic relations than folks who just identified as white. And that research was pretty interesting to me because, at that point, I was really trying to figure out, how do I have the white privilege conversation with my students? How do we do it in a way that doesn't lead to this reflexive defensiveness? And I started to do more of a deep dive into this research, and it started to really make a lot of sense because what it talks about is the more in which you know your cultural background, specifically, like for the example of European Americans like myself, what countries that your family originated from, the more you're able to do a compare and contrast with cultures that are different than yours. And one of the things that in just doing that research and finding that information is that it kind of held true almost intuitively for myself, because once I was able to know, say, that it's not a mistake that a large amount of European Americans who live in the South are of Scottish and Irish background, that it wasn't a mistake that a large amount of European Americans with an Italian background were in the East Coast bigger cities, that German Americans were predominantly populated in like the upper Midwest. And once I started to know the individual nuances of different European American cultures and how that's manifested here in the United States over the past 150 years, the more it started to make sense to me, the more I was able to find a language, I think, to talk to students about how do we have discussions of our own cultural identity when, especially for white or European American folks, we have the privilege of not really thinking about it, or in many cases, not even knowing about it as we grow up, which obviously is different for people who have kind of Latinx, African American, Native American backgrounds. So just doing the deep dive into this literature, having these conversations with students, building assignments in some cases around this, I found it to be really fruitful, and it's been kind of really an interest of mine ever since.
Wow. But you're saying that different groups went to different regions of the country. Okay, so
They,
say that again. Germans went where, Scottish went where? Do them one at a time.
yeah. So historically speaking, and again, it's not a monolith, right?
Sure.
There are definitely variations, but we're talking in disproportionate numbers. English and Irish Americans settled in the South. Um, then you had kind of German Americans who settled, and other kind of Eastern, Northern European countries settled predominantly in the upper Midwest. And then you had Italian Americans tend to settle a bit more predominantly in East Coast cities like New York, Boston, Philadelphia, places like that.
Fascinating. Just give me a
Yeah.
typical assignment that you gave your student that proved enlightening. And if you can even think of a particular student without identifying that person, just
Sure.
talk us through the experience a student might have
Yeah.
in one of your assignments.
Yeah. I had a inspiration from a colleague of mine who I was talking this research about, and they were like, you should probably try and work that into assignment. You seem really passionate about it. So what I did was I changed the existing autobiography assignment that I was using in intercultural communication, and I changed it to focus on students having to self-identify their cultural background and a belief, value, norm, and social practice that is common within that specific culture they identify with. And it was interesting because as I did the assignment more and more, for my students who are African American, Latinx, Native American, it was pretty easy because they grew up with an awareness and understanding of the nuances and the details of their culture. And the more I did it, the more I saw that students of European American backgrounds really struggled. And in several cases came to me and said, I have no culture, or I'm just American. And at first I kind of was like, how do I approach this? But then as I got more experienced in doing the assignment, thinking through it, I started to realize it was a really good learning opportunity to say, okay, what makes you think that you're solely American and that you don't have any additional cultural background? And they would say usually something to the effect of, well, I never knew or grew up with an awareness of like where my family was from. I said, okay, why don't you go do some digging? And you know, you don't have to go to ancestry.com necessarily, but you should go and talk to your family members, understand where your great grandparents came from, maybe when your lineage finally did reach the United States. And you know, not every student did that type of work, but those that did, I think, really benefited from it because, you know, in particular, I had one student who's on the rodeo team. She comes from like rural Nevada. And so she just very much identified with Western rodeo culture, essentially Western United States. And I had her, I said, this isn't enough because Western rodeo culture didn't just exist out of nowhere, right? It came from other countries' beliefs in like, you know, horses and self-preservation, the ideology of it. And then of course, like just how that manifests in the day-to-day living. And she did some background and found that she was part Scottish, part Norwegian American. And she asked me, she was like, this is like really cool, but I don't know what to do with this. And I said, well, research some of the cultural practices of people of those backgrounds. And inevitably what she found is, you know, a lot of Western American kind of cowboy rodeo culture stems from European origins, right? There's like famous examples of cowboys in Spain. There's famous examples, right, of especially rural areas, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, where horses are a big part of the culture. And so it was a really cool experience for her because it allowed her to open her eyes to say, I am part of a much bigger, longer history that goes back far deeper than my parents just being in the United States. And, you know, it gets complicated, right? Because some people don't really, you know, have several different cultural, ethnic backgrounds. So they're not always able to make that clear one-on-one connection. But usually enough students will say, I'd never thought about this, knew about this, or even realized there were larger influences on how I was raised, and I didn't even associate culture with them. And one of my goals that I've started to do more with that is to use that as the foundation. And I don't want to change the topic too much, but like as the foundation to have the white privilege discussion. And the more that I think this assignment comes first before I talk about that in my classes, the more I think openness people have shown, because there's a common understanding that we're building from to get them to see it is a privilege to not know your culture, to not have society remind you consistently what heritage you are and what maybe stereotypes are associated with that. So that's kind of where it started, and that's how it's manifested.
So this is totally fascinating. Connect
Mhm.
the dots between, I now know that I'm from Norwegian descent and
Mhm.
Scottish descent. I now know that. I understand and connect that with my cowboy United States heritage.
Yeah.
How does that help me with white privilege?
Yeah, that's a big discussion. So one of the things that the research talks about is the folks who know their ethnic heritage have a language of which to understand cultural differences better. Like, for example, Scottish American, as I mentioned before, I'm half Scottish American, are disproportionately represented in the South. And that's not by accident, because Scotland is known to be a more rural part of the United Kingdom, and especially one that's resistant to larger kind of, collectivistic cultural forces that come from, say, adhering to the British royalty in London in the UK. And so the cultural values we tend to associate with the South, that being individualism, like manifest destiny, let me explore and maximize what I myself as an individual can accomplish, that didn't just rise out of nowhere by people living in the South. It came in large part from folks from Western European countries in more rural areas who wanted to, similar to their distance they put between themselves and like the city of London, are putting themselves the same distance between, say, rural Arkansas from like New York City. And so for me, one of the things that I really tried to do in connecting the dots is the individualism of the cultural values, that sense of manifest destiny, that sense of I'm not connected with society, I can be self-sufficient on my own. That's something that historically ethnic minorities aren't able to do, right? The reality is, and you know this far better than I do, is it
No.
is a real it is a real privilege, right, to be able to say I don't have this cultural obligation to people who look like me. I have the ability and also kind of the interest to fight for my individual wants and desires. And the hard part, I think, explaining to students who are so used to, like I teach right now in, kind of the suburban, exurban parts of Arizona, it is hard to tell those folks that that is the foundation of a lot of values that exist here in this area, and that those values manifest in something like having a sense of privilege and identity and being defensive as soon as it's brought up. And so getting students to recognize that those cultural values embedded within where they grew up, like individualism, manifest destiny, those aren't necessarily bad. Those themselves are just cultural values, right? But when they are only accessible to you in large part because of your skin color and your ability to assimilate, and it's not an option for other cultural groups in the United States, that's a real problem and it has to be acknowledged. And that's kind of where I try and really
Whoa.
connect the dots.
I am blown away. I have never thought or connected the dots like you're saying. So let me say it back to
Yeah,
you and you correct
sure.
it, okay?
Yeah.
So come from a European country where there's horses and rural area and a sense of
Yeah.
independence.
Yeah.
Come to United States, bring those values with you. This new southern open landscape allows
Yeah.
that to be perpetuated. And so the descendants now grow up thinking that's all there is. And they have the freedom to
Yeah.
have that because nobody is sliding them, no one's enslaving them, no one's
Yeah. Yeah.
oppressing them. The oppressed groups have to have community, have to
Yeah.
have a sense of connection, have to
Exactly.
have we take care of each other versus this other Western European rural value of I can do anything, I'm in charge of me, I can take care of me and my family. And so if I recognize, if I'm from that Western European area and I recognize that that's my heritage, I can say, oh, that's a value. That's not just the way it is.
Exactly. And, you know, to not to go into even a different direction, but one of the big reasons I bring this up is, so kind of with the rise of Hitler, 1930s and Third Reich in Germany, you started to see more German Americans not emphasize their German heritage, that they wouldn't be as upfront about their cultural ethnic identity the way in which you see traditionally like Italian Americans or Greek Americans do. And part of the reason that's so important is so many people of German American heritage have no idea that they're of German American heritage because their families de-emphasized it during World War II, you know, immediately before and immediately after. And the white privilege discussion is so important to me in that respect, because without knowing that history, you probably will think that you're just straight up American and magically your family got here like 200 years ago and it was just everything was created from then on. And so more people, that's something that I've been happy to see people look up their heritage, see that maybe they're half or quarter or full German American, and therefore get to understand this is in large part why you never knew that, because there was social pressures that allowed you, or that maybe indicated it would be smart for your family to de-emphasize their German heritage. And I usually, when I bring that up, try and add to the discussion. That's kind of another facet of white privilege, because Japanese Americans were not able to do that. There's no way that they could de-emphasize their cultural identity because it's just more apparent in terms of their skin color, in terms of the differences, right, that it had from the dominant culture being kind of European American at large. And so those histories, I think, and how they manifest in cultural values, communication, I've always found that fascinating. And I think it's been a good way to get students to think beyond the reflexive, you have white privilege, no, I don't, my family was born and raised poor, which is what too often I think it turns into, is to see the broader cultural frameworks at play and how they've developed over time.
Wow. Okay, so I want to ask you something.
Sure.
Some friends of mine and I have been speculating about the term race, period. When I did my dissertation, I used the term social race throughout it. And I resolved then that I was going to use that term instead of race to make it very clear. I'm talking about a social grouping, not a biological grouping. So friends of mine have been arguing that, at least one friend, that we should drop race and just refer to ethnicity. Do you have an opinion about that?
Yeah, that's a great one. I think it's important to understand the term race as like a sociological construct. I think it is a good thing for people to know and recognize, because I think so often, and understandably so, a lot of folks coming out of high school into college, when they hear race, they just think skin color, they think biological. And so I think for me, it's always been an important foundation to say what we think of as race in very small parts is biological, and in large part is cultural. Or I should say is socially ingrained. I think if we want to use that as the background and then focus more on ethnicity going forward to explain and contextualize interactions between people of different cultures and how, you know, maybe conflict has developed, how differing values have developed, I think I'd be in favor of that. But I think, to me, understanding the history of race and then dispelling the misconceptions, I think probably has to come first, because without that context, it would be hard for me, I think, to get my students to see how our understanding of ethnicity and culture has gotten to where it is now. I think dispelling the misconceptions of race probably is necessary first, but I think focusing more on ethnicity from that point on, I think does make sense to me.
Wow. Okay, so race would be the broad construct, ethnicity is the subconstruct under it, which makes sense to me because I have friends. I just made the acquaintance of a young woman from Jamaica who's going to be working with us. Then I have African friends, and then there's Southern Black versus Northern Black. So we do have,
Yeah.
under the rubric of Black, there are the subcategories.
Yeah.
So that would make sense. Okay, love it. Okay, so now I'm seriously curious about you.
Okay.
How did you get interested in this? Why do you care? Why are you concerned enough about race and white privilege and ethnicity and all of that to teach it? So tell us about growing up, where
So
you came from.
that's interesting. So I come from the central coast of California, this little town called Arroyo Grande. It's near San Luis Obispo, Pismo Beach, on the coast halfway between LA and San Francisco. And it's interesting because that area is very white and largely pretty wealthy, but also has like a good degree of like agricultural kind of farmland areas. And growing up, I was on the high school debate team. I was that very typical debater in high school who thought, oh, look at me, I'm reading these, I'm like reading Foucault for the first time. Now my eyes are open to the world and I can see through the matrix. But in reality, at that point, I think I got enamored with having a sense of history and context for what's happened. Like my love of history. Both my grandfathers fought in World War II and would talk about stories of what they experienced abroad. So I think there was always that kernel of interest I had growing up of like, what is it like in different places? How are people from different cultures? Why are they different than they are, say, here in the US? Then I had a pretty big culture shock when I go from my small coastal, largely white town to University of Nevada, Las Vegas. And UNLV is one of the 5 most diverse universities in the nation. And it was there where I had it was my first time where I was in the ethnic minority in most every classroom, and especially in like my friend groups. And it's funny because it didn't bother me. It wasn't something that was shocking to me, but it revealed to me much more about how I was raised and how different I am from other people, just based off the fact a good amount of folks were, say, Hawaiian from in around Honolulu, good amount of African American students who are friends of mine from Vegas, LA, Bay Area, a good amount of Latinx friends of mine from in and around kind of similar areas, LA, Las Vegas, places like that. And as I was thinking about kind of my background, I started to realize that I had kind of done what a lot of especially suburban white guys in the 90s and 2000s had done, which is I gravitated toward aspects of African American culture celebrated in the media, but I had never gone through the awareness of why am I attracted to it? Is there some degree of privilege where I can say I want to be like this, but also not join in with the struggle for the people who are putting out that music or those, are participating in those sports. And so
Thank
for
you.
me, what's up?
I said thank you.
Oh yeah, that's right. And honestly, that experience at UNLV with so many friends of so many different backgrounds we would be able to talk about a lot of the same interests with music and sports and things like that. But then when the conversation would go more serious, I kind of felt silent, and I did what unfortunately too many white folks do, which is like, hey, if I don't say or participate, then I can't be called a racist. I won't say anything racist. And when I got to graduate school, and especially University of Arkansas, and understanding the history of race at that university and in that state and in the South in general, it was kind of the wake-up call that I needed to say, I care a lot about these, like concepts of egalitarian coming from John Locke and these philosophers in the UK. I care a lot about understanding world events. But I started to realize how inept I was in listening to the experiences of people and of the culture that I idolized, and how I had essentially been using it for my own benefit, of saying, let me listen to this hip hop artist, or let me, love the history of like John Carlos and Tommy Smith in the Olympics, and kind of, like how cool the images were and how cool it seemed to me. But I'd never made the connection between what type of struggle went into that. And so when I got out of graduate school and I started teaching at Phoenix College, which is similar demographically, very diverse, I kind of made a commitment to myself of, I've seen now too many examples of white folks who are afraid to have the tough conversations, who are afraid to engage in self-interrogation. And I went through a lot in graduate school and as an undergrad to try and say, let me really think through why I've been attracted to this culture and why I haven't felt the need to stand up for these things that I profess to love and value. And so it's been a long-term journey, but I think just having those thoughts, being honest with myself, but then also having academics and friends of all different backgrounds see in me this kind of need and want to do this, and try and say, like, look, you can talk about this stuff. That was one of the great things that happened even with my job at Central Arizona College for the first year, when I was I co-created and kind of put together the Diversity Inclusion Advisory Council, and we were looking for someone to head it, and I was the one who voted in, and I initially turned it down. I said, we shouldn't have like a straight white guy as the head of this diversity inclusion committee. This sounds really bad. And then the other committee members, Asian American, African American predominantly, said to me, like, that's actually pretty insulting that you would say that you would step down because you're insulting our intelligence and our individual agency to say, we need allies in this fight who will like step forward, who understand it. And the more you skirt away from those responsibilities, the less credibility you have to be an agent of change. And that was a big wake-up call for me, because
so powerful.
It is. And I honestly, I needed it, because I think this is something I try and see and point out and help with other kind of white folks that I know, which is, we know the language of equality. We know how to use the right social media hashtags, but when the time comes to like put your neck out there and take a risk, it's easy to be like, I'm just not the right spokesperson, and it's not, what I've learned is, at least in my experience, it's not about being the right spokesperson. It's so many folks of different cultural backgrounds have spent so many years fighting this fight essentially by themselves. And the more, especially white folks, take the risk of public backlash, or take the risk of maybe getting heat from administration, that type of risk needs to be taken more by more white folks, and not just hashtags and social media campaigns, but actually being a part of groups that do organizing, that teach these concepts in the classroom, stuff like that. So all those experiences together, I think, helped me see you have to practice what you preach. And to practice it means to recognize your role, like your the fact that you are white, and use that privilege of being kind of like an educated white male who are from, my parents were teachers, that the more that I can be at the forefront of articulating these concepts to audiences who unfortunately may not be so, may not listen quite as much to people with different backgrounds, that I can speak to them. And that's my duty, really, to speak to them so that way change can happen.
Okay, so have you been trashed by white people for the stance you're taking?
Yes, I have. And it's not the traditional, you're a sellout, or like, it hasn't been that so much. And some of it, unfortunately, has been from family, which is tough. But I think there's a sense of, you're just kind of going on with the liberal mob. It's like you are now like a pawn in the game of this like hyper liberal academia, to be able to uh, kind of tear down all that is great and beautiful about like American values. That's kind of more of the resistance that I've gotten. Other folks have gotten it far worse than I have. So I don't want to act like I really encountered that much resistance. I think the one thing that I try and do is, thankfully, my family in its roots in kind of different regions of rural America and kind of even where I grew up, which is not anything like LA or San Francisco. It's a much smaller, kind of more conservative community. I think my focus has been realizing that principles of like interpersonal communication, about how to connect with others, that's not separate from elements related to intercultural communication. So I've tried to kind of break down the initial barriers to say, let me role play as someone different than you and just ask you questions. And I think that's one of the things that, unfortunately, not everyone has the privilege or the ability to do that or to be listened to. But I've been lucky enough that a lot of people have been willing to engage with me by just asking them questions of like, hey, so, why do you think it's important that to recognize that people, say, of Japanese American descent can't assimilate to a culture the way in which people who are German American could de-emphasize their cultural traits? And just having those conversations.
Repeat that again. That's really this is gold here, what you're giving us.
Yeah, I appreciate that.
This is the question I get asked all the time.
Sure, yeah.
What do I do with grandpa at Christmas dinner, right? Yeah. So you're giving us the answer. So just take it really slow. Yeah. Don't skip steps.
Okay. I don't know if it's the answer, but I'd like to think it's the important part of the conversation for sure. So the question I would ask to folks who are willing to engage with me on this would be to say, why do you think it matters that German Americans could de-emphasize their cultural background in ways that, say, during World War II, Japanese Americans could not? And those are the types of questions that I have found are rooted in a lot of ways in interpersonal communication, which is you're not using this kind of hyper-partisan, defensive, like destructive conflict engagement tactics. But instead, what you're doing is saying, let's just talk about an objective part of history, and let's try and make sense of why that matters with how different cultures of people, different ethnicities have different experiences in the US. And the more we can tie those experiences to what's happening right now, the more I think then hopefully people will start to ease down their defenses and be willing to kind of engage in that discussion. And that's, to be honest, that's something that actually, I haven't really done this much yet, but you've given me the idea to talk in my courses about how could that time in history during World War II with those two ethnic groups help to make sense of why, unfortunately, Asian Americans now in the United States we're seeing increase in hate crimes in a world because of COVID-19, the misconceptions that have gone along with that. So for me, asking questions that are not rooted in a very clear, specific ideology, but kind of connecting the dots through past, present, those are important parts that, to a degree that there is success in breaking through in a polarized country, that's where I've been able to experience it in that respect.
Okay, so going high level for a minute. First, you're asking questions and not making statements, right? Yeah. And so when you say this is interpersonal communication, that's the nugget of interpersonal communication, which is ask questions. Yeah. Don't assert your opinions as much as ask questions. So first you're doing that. Then you're moving into cognitive dissonance. You're having this person contrast two conflicting thoughts. So on the one hand, the Germans can de-emphasize their ethnicity and the Japanese Americans cannot. Why is that? So now I got to entertain two conflicting thoughts and my mind goes, and so that in itself helps me think about things differently. So those are that's two of the tools you're using, correct?
Correct.
So the person stumbles around with an answer, right? Because they've never thought about it before. So they start
Yeah.
stumbling around. And then what?
Yes. Then it goes potentially many different directions it goes. But I think the defensive response I get the most is that's the past. That's not the present, right?
Ah,
That happened 80 years ago. The Nazis aren't around, the way they were then. And to kind of maybe even bring it full circle where we started off this, one of the important things that I try to be clear on when I talk about people knowing your European American heritage as a way to break down bias, why I don't think this gets talked about a lot, even in academic circles, is because it's kind of tricky. Because as we know, white supremacist groups have co-opted that language to say, not just I know my heritage, but I'm trying to quote unquote protect it from these invaders, which we all know is code for people of different cultural backgrounds coming into the US, diversifying the country as a whole. And it is easy to make that leap with like, I'm Scottish and Irish. I believe in the superiority of my culture. It's so great. I want to take pride in it. And there has to be the discussion of recognizing your culture heritage isn't meant to be engaging in an ethnocentrism and trying to develop this pride of superiority of others. It's if I can understand that Scottish Americans tend to believe to a larger degree in individualism, manifest destiny, not being connected to the collective, the more I can make sense of why, unfortunately, African Americans from the South experienced in many ways the racism they did, because the cultural values, among many other things, was very different. And therefore that difference, right, was feared and used to oppress, as opposed to say, you're different, let's find a way to coexist with these differences. So for me, that I think is the importance of being clear and specific in this discussion, because the more ways in which we can be aware of our cultural backgrounds, but not use it as a way to justify superiority and inferiority, but to understand differences and maybe how to bridge those. I think that's kind of the key point to the discussion. And that's where I try and lead it to. And unfortunately, what we saw in Charlottesville with the, Jews will not replace us and the protection of the statues rally, I think enough examples of that have happened, especially over the past 5 years, to say to people, it's not past, it's still with us. And that's where I try and, it's tough territory to tread, but I try and make that connection of like that Charlottesville rally. It is significant that they were not wearing hoods, because it really made them feel that my viewpoint is now mainstream. Therefore, I don't have to protect my identity. I can assert the superiority of it. And that, I think, was, if we're talking about reasons why I really wanted to emphasize this, that, in my white privilege, stunned me to the degree to which that happened. And it really woke me up on an individual level to say, I have to do more to combat the fact that this is still so accepted.
okay. So I'm struck. Okay. This is just great, Barry. I just have to say, this is
Thank you.
This is more than I could have hoped for from an interview. Okay. So here, there's up, down, and there's in, out, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So what you're saying is that some people would say, because I'm Scottish, I have to be up, down. And I have to be superior to the other groups because I have to be proud of me. And you're saying, no, that's not so. There's a cultural value here that you have that promotes your thinking that way. And there's a cultural value that other groups might have. And these are just all cultural values. So you're trying to get people to not think up and down, but to think horizontally.
Yeah. Exactly.
Is that okay? I hope y'all understand what I'm saying here. Yeah. Okay. So I forgot her last name. Janelle, the Zero Sum Game. I don't have a book right here. Heather McGee. The Sum of Us, about this. Are you familiar with that book?
No, I've heard the name of the book, but I never read it.
I love this book, The Sum of.
Okay.
Okay. So her thesis is that what's underlying a lot of what's going on in this country is the zero sum game. The assumption that the more you get, the less I get. The assumption that the more your group gets, the less that's available to mine. Right? And what you're saying is trying to help people understand, no, this is not a zero sum game. We don't have to have a hierarchy. We don't have to have one group over the other group. We can all just have different cultural values.
Yeah.
Is that?
Yeah, no, exactly it. And a big thing for me has been is to kind of use the knowledge I developed over time of kind of, like Enlightenment era philosophy, especially as it regards to, say, like Descartes or John Locke. And there's kind of this notion, and I'm sure you're just as familiar with it as I am, especially when you go to school, high school, college, about the Enlightenment and how transformative Western cultural knowledge is, and just how impressive the development of these ideas were for like the history of the world. And I think one of the issues is not that history is bad to be taught. I think it is really important, especially in how it's influenced the development of our country. But by having that be the emphasis, we then kind of make the assumption that other cultures did not have any type of like intellectual capacity that Western culture did, or that, say, for example, right, the longevity of cultures in the Middle East and East Asia, a culture doesn't exist for that long and that successfully without there being a strong intellectual foundation, right? I think we all can hopefully agree on that. And the problem, though, is most people aren't taught, why is it that Enlightenment era ideology was spread while, say, Buddhist or other maybe East Asian cultural values were more self-contained? And the more people know, and hopefully will understand, that it's not because European American culture necessarily was so vastly superior that only people of our cultural background had the ability to spread it, is that the cultural values were different, right? Like Chinese culture, Egyptian cultures were believed in collectivism. That is, as long as the collective identity of our cultural group was strong, and it was working, what's the need to go necessarily, spread it to all countries all over the world? Whereas we know, right, Western American or Western European cultural values are about individualism, right, manifest destiny, those types of things. And I think that's a big reason why, for me, one of, and I can't say that in my classes that we get into this that much, and I would try and kind of help my students with these arguments. I would try and tell them, like, these notions of like racial equality and fighting for racial equality, I think an important foundation, especially if European Americans are going to engage in this, is to say, I recognize kind of what I've been taught is the singular view of like the cultural intellectual superiority of the Enlightenment, when in reality, if I can value, say, like East Asian cultural values that have existed for centuries, the more I can make sense of that, why there should be equality of people of those cultural backgrounds.
Wow. Yeah. That's just marvelous.
Thank you.
Just marvelous. Because yes, right now I'm thinking of a white guy, who's all into the Enlightenment, thinks it's God's gift to the humanity, and does not recognize other cultures have similar profound values and contributions.
Yeah.
And so you're saying the reason the Enlightenment spread is part of this whole manifest destiny ideology.
Yeah, that being a core cultural value of Western European cultures, for sure. It's just that notion of individual agency and what that means for not just the creation and an understanding of knowledge, but also what that means for how that ideology should be discussed and then, communicated, which unfortunately, if we're talking negative things, right, can help explain the degree to which colonialism took place.
It's colonialism, yes.
Exactly.
I was
Yeah.
thinking what he's saying, what you're saying, I'm thinking to myself, what he's saying is there's a colonialism of ideas that's been disseminated. My ideology, the Enlightenment, all of that, we're going to disseminate that, and we're going to conquer the world with our ideology, not just rooting, going after gold and diamonds, but and spices, but going after ideas. There was that colonial mindset about ideas.
Yeah. And and the hard part, about this is I think people will look at arguments like that and say, you hate freedom, you hate Western ideology, you want to overthrow it. And I think the difficulty in having these conversations sometimes is it's a really nuanced argument to say that that cultural values each have their like strengths and weaknesses in terms of how they impact others. And that's where I've been trying to, especially the past couple of years, say, okay, let me go read more kind of conservative, traditional, maybe even like reactionary discussions of this. And I have a good amount of friends, especially when I was at Grand Canyon University, more conservative Christian college. And I think there's this assumption that to attach, something like the Enlightenment era philosophy to colonialism is just to take this really negative view of self-hatred. When in reality, I try and reframe it as, no, we have to understand that like individual values, say related to like First Amendment freedom of speech, is a foundational strength of kind of like Western European, I would say, ideology. What is not, however, a strength of, say, Western European individualistic ideology is to engage in issues, say, for example, related to public health and wearing a mask, or knowing when that your individual dissemination of your messages starts to then infringe upon like the collective good of other people. And that's what's hard is, especially, as a communication professor, I'm always thinking about how do you get that across to people, that there's nuance here that's required, that to say that Western Enlightenment ideology is connected to imperialism doesn't mean it's always intrinsically bad, but we have to be honest and instead say, where can it be beneficial? Like for me, my background in a lot of ways is freedom of speech. In terms of freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, amazing. In terms of asserting its righteousness of people who have different cultural values that are happy with the way it is, not as good, not as righteous. So yeah, that's the struggle of finding the nuance in this discussion.
Now, I, as a Black professor and leadership consultant, encounter that because some people hear that if I criticize anything Black, I'm now giving fuel to the oppressor. And I'm saying, no, we are not perfect as a people. We are not perfect. And there are some cultural things that are harmful. And so let's own up to that. And I get attacked sometimes for even, I can feel my heart starting to beat just saying it out loud right now for the podcast, but it has to be said. As you're saying, there's good and there's bad. There's good in all cultures that's worthy of dissemination, and there are other things of cultures that can be harmful, both to the people into the culture and the people outside. And so that nuanced thing that you're saying, I think it's universal for people to say, if you criticize any part of me, you're criticizing all of me.
Yeah. And you're right. And I think that type of discussion is so important with white European American folks, because the more that I can decenter from what my cultural background is and just be connected to like a specific country in the here and now or in very recent past, it makes it easier for me to not have to think about how my ancestors have shaped the history of the US and shaped parts of the history of the world. And to me, that's so important, because to say, for example, not to always delve into different topics here, but to understand why there has been such opposition to, say, voting restrictions in different states throughout the South, like Georgia, you can't divorce that from, say, the history of voter suppression, especially of African Americans, that led to the creation of the Voting Rights Act, right? And unfortunately, a lot of people also don't know that most of the Voting Rights Act in the last decade had been struck down as part of like the enforcement mechanisms, because the Supreme Court had ruled, hey, there's not poll taxes anymore. We're good. We don't need this. And that's where my hope is that the more people are willing to, and especially white allies in this, are willing to like receive some of the criticism by bringing up history, bringing up the past, that if you can connect it effectively to now and show the connection, then you start to hopefully create a foundation for people to push back against this. Stop bringing up old stuff. Why do you hate yourself and your culture? Those types of things. So yeah, I think that that notion of being honest with our cultural values is a tough one to have. And my hope is that the more we're able to reframe it, not as you're a bad person because you're part of this culture, but instead say you have to reckon with what influences you've had that have caused harm in the past. The only way to make sure it doesn't happen in the future is if you acknowledge and recognize how it happened in the first place. So those are big things that I care a lot about, trying to teach the next generation of folks to kind of look at it in that way.
Okay, so I'm looking at the time. I want to ask this one question. We just
Sure.
barely have time for it.
Yeah.
Racial identity and communication styles. I did a blog on differences between Black and white communication styles.
Yeah.
Would you say, do you see in general, we're not talking about your friend your friend Reagan or whomever, but culturally, are there cultural differences in communication styles? And what would you say they are? Is that what you mean by when you say the term racial identity and communication styles? Or does it mean something different?
Yeah. So the field of intercultural communication has found that the kind of insular cultural backgrounds of like, say, Black American, African Americans in the United States versus European Americans, that the differences based off of the experience, based off of the cultural values, have shaped differences in communication. So one of the things that we know, at least in terms of, and again, this changes, not everyone is, of course, like a robotic application of what culture they come from. But for example, the use of metaphor and the use of kind of poetry as a means of communicating persuasion, we know is historically more rooted in African American culture, just in part to, just to make sense of the experiences of collective identity during times of oppression as a way to kind of imagine and work together to, create a collective support system. So that would be why you tend to see, for example, when I was a speech coach, if you go to the national championship final rounds of like poetry interpretation, dramatic interpretation, most of the speakers are African American, and it is, I think, rooted to some degree in a different communication style that's geared towards storytelling, narrative, poetry, things like that. Another difference that we know is white or European American folks are known to be more low context cultural communication values, meaning direct verbal messages, less indirect nonverbal messages. And whereas we know, say, African American, Native American, especially cultures tend to be more high context, that is, less direct verbal communication strategies. And one of the reasons that I think understanding, even if those are oversimplifications to a degree in like a diversifying culture, I think it's important to understand that, because how we have been able to talk about things publicly and the degree to which, say, for example, people of different cultural backgrounds have felt silenced and can't say anything, is those difference in communication values. It's easy for, white American folks to have the discourse around race that they want, because the culture of communication with many European Americans is direct, is saying, stop complaining about race. You can do something to change your situation. And in different cultures that have developed a more collectivistic identity, there is not often that ingrained social virtue of being direct and aggressive in communication style. And I think, unfortunately, kind of going back to the individualism versus collectivism discussion we were having, the more that white European American folks are aware of and reckon with the directness of which we are used to communicating to others, the more that maybe we can take a step back from that in these discussions of like racial equality. And the more we recognize, hey, maybe how we approach the communication in verbal directness hasn't always been the best. Let me now take a step back and allow for different, more high context communication strategies to be part of the public discussion.
Okay.
And I think,
I just want to make sure we're not losing people.
Sorry. You're right. I know I went a little
give a high context. Give an example of a high context statement and a low context statement, and then do a direct and an indirect.
So probably the easiest way I could explain it is when, say, American business folks are going to Japan or China, they have the best ones who know how to adapt to cultural values won't ever say something like, hey, nice to meet you, let's get down to business. Like, let's get down to business would be a very low context communication message, because it's not all worried about how we interact emotionally, how we connect on an interpersonal basis. It's saying that our presence talking to each other is solely transactional, that I make that very clear up front. Whereas in like East Asian cultures, when doing business, you'll see 5 to 10 minutes of what we might consider small talk of like, hey, where are you from? Like, like what's your family background a bit? What experiences or travels have you done? And so once those like interpersonal niceties or those like small talk has happened, then like business can take place. So in terms of verbal messages, that would be the example of the difference of like, hey, nice to meet you, let's get down to business, versus, hey, so, tell me a little bit about your family, where you're from. That would be high context versus low context.
Okay, so context means you talk to the whole person, basically.
Yeah.
The whole person, versus low context is speech to speech, and the person doesn't count.
Yeah, it's more of, actually probably a better way to explain it is clarity of intent. Like if I were to say, you are being mean to me, I'm clearly like making a very clear, direct statement about how what you're saying emotionally impacts me. If I were to say, hey, there are times where messages that are used kind of create this sense of feeling in me of, I don't know if I feel quite as confident or strong in myself, right? So like in that instance, the verbal messages are indirect in trying to get across that what you're saying is hurting me. Whereas low context cultures, it's, I'm going to make it very clear, you are being mean. Does that kind of explain it better? Because
yes,
I realize
it really does. And I get accused of being low context. As I'm listening to you, I know some people are going to listen to this and they're going to laugh. Say, Gene, see? I can be very direct.
I think, my perception too much. I feel like academia almost kind of like it really forces that, right? Because otherwise I think you feel, I don't know. I felt that way too, where like, I feel like I have to be low context to assert that I can be part of the academy. So I understand where you're coming from.
Oh, that may be. Somebody has asked me, does that come from being an academic? And you're saying so. So it probably, that would make sense, because you got to make your point. You got to make your point and get out, because others are competing to make their point.
Yeah, that's a great point. True.
Okay, so the difference that you're saying then is the low tech context versus the high context. Okay, got that. Anyway, so summarize then your main point about the low versus high in terms of ethnic groups.
Yeah, so this has been something, like just for example, right, the recent horrific tragedies, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, especially the recent trial of Derek Chauvin for George Floyd. I've been reading articles from some more conservative folks saying this isn't systemic racism because there is no empirical, clear, direct statement or action that Derek Chauvin took that indicated he believed in racial superiority of white people. And I find that argument to be, I think, representative of how low context kind of European American cultural values can inadvertently or sometimes directly increase and stabilize conditions of racism. Because one of the things that mindset allows you to then do is I can then spin the experiences of people who are African American who dealt with this the entirety of their lives. Any, say, discussion of their experiences, what they've gone through, right? I can spin that as subjective. I can spin that as them experiencing and having an emotional reaction, whereas I can see it as an outsider from a rational third party. And part of I think the big reason why high and low context communication I'm so passionate about is if we can get people to stop thinking, especially white European American folks, because someone's experience can be individualized, doesn't make it irrational, doesn't make it completely subjective. And I think that's the problem is we can all find ways to logically invalidate someone's experience because someone else has maybe had a different one. But if there are enough voices in a high context manner saying the same thing, we have to treat it exactly over centuries. We have to treat it as the same degree of evidence as maybe statistical calculations that are used in low context arguments. So that's kind of my big speech I give about why we can't dismiss experiences and people's stories, because at the end of the day, they're not irrational subjective. They're a form of evidence that some cultures are more used to using as evidence in what they say. And that white European Americans, I think we have to do a lot better in saying this person's experience is in and of itself evidence that's worthy to hear and learn from. And especially when it is combined with all these other experiences from centuries. And I'm hoping that, the more those experiences are heard, the more progress we can make. But it's sad that we have to put that burden on too many folks, especially folks of color, to have to articulate the trauma they've gone through to convince people it should be taken seriously.
That's so magnificent, because what I'm clicking to is the essence of science is replication. And so you can have replication in a low context way of saying, I've examined this singular person's evidence, and I have found it to be wanting. Or you can have replication in a high context way of saying, I've heard the same story again and again and again and again and again and again and again. We have replication, and that's a valid means of persuasion. That's just as valid as examining one and dissecting that argument.
Exactly. And that's where, and that's something that I hope gets more media discussion, like the aftermath of the Derek Chauvin trial is, look, the act of standing on someone's neck for that long doesn't necessitate them to have to say the N-word to know how much they treat, how low they treat the life of in this case, George Floyd. And I think, this goes in, I know we're wrapping up, so this is a deeper discussion, but I think unfortunately, the low context communication behaviors, especially amongst European Americans, has made it so that way the definition of racism can be so small, and that verbal directness of making it very tight is what allows for us to feel like, you know what, Derek Chauvin wasn't racist. He just got he just kind of lost control of his emotions, or what, it wasn't aware, or he's a bad apple. And my hope is that if we can reframe the experiences of people and get them to see that if you accept high context communication behaviors, you won't always need someone to say the N-word to see that they have racism in their heart, that other high context nonverbal actions can demonstrate that just as clearly.
Okay, so I want to wrap this up. This has been totally fascinating. I'm sitting up here thinking I'm gonna figure out how to form another question and have you come back in a few months,
Sure.
what weeks or what have you, because what you are on, what I would want when you come back is concrete examples. Let's take a specific scenario. Let's work it through.
Yeah.
So let's
Yeah.
work it through. How would you talk to Uncle Joe at Christmas dinner? How would
Yeah.
you talk to Mr. Logic who says just the facts, ma'am? And how would
Yeah.
you talk to that person and lead them to expand? What exercises do you have? Let's just literally work through a concrete example of that.
Yeah.
I would
I'd love to. I spend too much time reading news anyway, and so I got all these random examples that I don't know if I'll ever talk about, that I know. So if I can apply them like with you, that I'd love to do that.
Oh, okay. Let's aim for it. Okay, so Professor Dr. Barry Regan from now College of Humanities and Social Sciences at Purdue University Global. Thank you for a most enlightening conversation.
Thank you, Jean. I can't tell you how important it is, I think, for folks to hear you talk about this and hear these discussions. So thank you for giving me and other people a platform to talk about this.